That'll be an awkward start.
All right. Welcome to Emory. Glad to have you here. I'm going to do my best to introduce you all to the topic of immigration. One of the difficulties in this particular conversation is that the gap in experience and debate in this room is huge, but a lot of you have never debated before. Some of you are middle school all-stars. Some of you have been debating in high school on a whole bunch of levels. And so my goal is to talk to you about immigration in a way that's digestible for everyone along that spectrum. So if you have questions about topic content, questions about immigration, questions about the information around immigration, I'll take those at the end. There's a giant glossary at the end of my lecture. I'm going to be happy to answer any questions about that. But if you have any questions about debate or debate language or anything like that, you should save those for your lab leaders. You're going to spend about 100 hours with them over the next week or two. And so write those down in the margins of your notes. Ask any questions you have. If there are any words that I say that you don't necessarily know what they mean, go ahead and raise your hand. But don't be upset if I'm like, oh, that'd be a great Miss Donnenfeld question, or you should ask your lab leaders that. We've chosen for the topic, and by we, I mean a panel of very smart people, that the topic for policy debate for the entire year will be immigration. And we're going to use that for our debates here at the ENDI to sort of center the conversation, what we should research, what we should talk, and we use that as a starting point to just, educate and have fun policy debates. This is called a resolution. I encourage you to write it down, although you can Google it and find it as well. Just debate national 2018 topic. And we'll get back to it at the end, but it's the frame that we use to sort of shape debates. It goes out in all invitations for policy debate. It sort of formulates it, and one side will say yes and the other side will say no. But it's just the United States federal government, so 3 branches, should substantially reduce its restrictions on legal immigration to the United States. And that's what we're going to talk about. I'm going to do my best to fill in a lot of blanks to make sure that we have a common set of knowledge to talk about, speak from, and that sort of stuff. So first, I found this totally interesting, and a lot of the beginning of this slide comes from a conversation I had with my 7-year-old where I said, what would you like to know about immigration? And then, I looked up some data to make sure we had all of that, so we're starting from the same spot. And this question she asked was like, well, how many immigrants are there in the United States, Dad? And so this is a really fun statistic from the USCIS. It's the Center for Immigration Studies and Statistics, I think. And it breaks it down by year, and then the size of the immigrant population, and then what share of the American population that total immigration number makes up. And so as you can see, it's going up, both in what this phrase we would call real numbers. So the total actual numbers in 2016, they reported roughly 43.7 million immigrants living in the United States, which compose 13.5%. And so you'll also notice in terms of percentage of the total GDP, it's also going up a lot. And a phrase that pops up that you'll see is that we're a nation of immigrants. A nation of immigrants, we're made almost entirely. And I like to think about that as if we took this chart and we went all the way back to like 1740, this number would be 100%. Because while there were native peoples here, obviously, we should always talk about and recognize that, the population of people who were talking about and structuring the government had all come from France, Britain, and other parts, and had made it up. And so at some point, if you draw the line back, unless you're fully native or partially native, we have some immigrant background. And I'll talk later about how we sort of define that. Next, I thought it was interesting to break it down by states. This is sort of the same chart. It just has some information in terms of how it increased. So on the left side is the absolute growth, or just the total number of people. So it should be no surprise to you what the 5 biggest states that added immigrants are, because they are the 5 most populous states. Like, that one's not particularly interesting. California, Texas, New York, and Florida have a much larger population than all of the other states. Illinois lags a good bit behind Florida. But that's why those states have more representation in the House of Representatives, because their population is so big. On the right side is the total numbers that have been added between 2000 and 2016. And you start to see New Jersey popping up a little bit. New Jersey replaces Illinois. But other than that, just the general absolute hasn't changed too much since 2000. I'm far more interested in this here, because it's the percentage growth of the population. I find that a lot more interesting than the absolute. Because if we just look at the absolute, California and Texas are always going to be 1 and 2. During the 90s, these 5 states added the largest percent growth of immigrants. North Carolina, Georgia, Nevada, Arkansas, and Utah. I think it's interesting that those were, you know, the Southeast. This one's kind of right in the middle of the country, getting a lot of immigrants. And so is Utah. It's interesting. If you ask people to talk about the statistics, they don't really have a lot of reasons. They will say that maybe it was jobs, the availability of jobs. I've listened to several reports that there was just an explosion of agricultural jobs in Georgia. Chicken consumption in this country quadrupled during the 90s. So just like the total amount of chicken. And so a bunch of chicken farms were exploding along North Carolina and Georgia. And a lot of the statistics say that that's why that immigration flood, they were literally trying to do it. This has happened, though, since 2000. And that's a percent growth of the population. I think the numbers are a little lower. A lot of people talk about why that might be. It represents a larger span. Everyone see that it's 16 years as opposed to 10, but the percent growth has gone down. There was a recession in the United States during this time. We've had 2 straight administrations, or the Obama administration really cracked down on border security. A lot of people, the numbers went down. South Dakota, then South Carolina, North Dakota. So the Dakotas became very popular. Although in my mind, when I see 129% increase in South Dakota, I think that means like 9 more people. Yeah. Tennessee, and then Delaware. And you'll notice Delaware wasn't even 100% increase, but it makes the number 5. Does everyone understand what I mean when I say the difference between absolute versus percentage growth? I just made a joke about it, but that kind of explained it. Let's say there are only 10 people in Delaware and 10 million people in California. And adding 10 more people doubles the size of Delaware. Adding 10 more people, no one in California would notice. So, what are some frequently asked questions that popped up? I kind of got these from a combination of like some immigrant websites and some other debate forums and stuff. Sort of went around and asked questions, and then once I get through my list, I'm going to encourage you. How many immigrants reside in the United States today? I've already given you this statistic. Does anyone remember it? 43.7 million immigrants reside in the United States. That makes up 13.5% of the total population. The U.S. population, they say, is about 323 million people in 2016. Between 2015 and 2016, and you can write this in quotes, foreign-born population, the foreign-born population, added about 500,000 people, or about 1%. Between 2000 and 2015, the United States averaged about 2%. So we had about 15 years of 2%, and then in 2016, we were down to 1%. So the actual rate of foreign-born population increase is gone way down. Well, how many total immigrants moved to the United States in 2016? I say 2016 because it's the best statistics that they have out. They're still working on the 2017 stuff. They're still waiting on some reports. But in 2016, 1.49 million foreign-born individuals moved to the United States. The number one country to add foreign-born population to the U.S.? Anyone want to take any guesses? Huh?
Syria?
No, that'd be nice, but no. Yeah. India. Boom. Congratulations. India was the leading country. 175,000 Indian-born persons joined the U.S. population. Anybody want to take a shot at number 2? Nope. China. There we go. And when they count China for the United States, they also count Taiwan and Hong Kong. I know that's controversial. Don't mean to offend any Taiwanese. They added about 160,000. All right, I've heard number 3. What is it? Mexico. 150,000. To round out the top 5, we could guess. One of those was a new one on the list. 50,000 came from Cuba. And 46,000 from the Philippines. Mexico was number 1 for a couple of decades, but in 2013, India and China jumped over Mexico and have been ahead since. So 2013, Mexico dropped to number 3. The big ones that added to the list, I've already told you, Cuba. Cuba had a 74% increase. It was a huge jump in the number of Cubans that were coming to the United States in 2016. There was some easing of relations between the countries, opened up some travel flights and some opportunities. Canadian arrivals since 2010 has dropped big time. Only 38,000 Canadians became Americans or joined the U.S. population in 2016. If I had a pie chart and I couldn't find it, it's like 100,000, and then it just keeps going down, and it's been going down every year for about 2 decades. Canadians must like being cold. Number 3. This is going to be a long answer. But the topic asks you, we want to debate about laws and immigration. I'm not going to bore you with going back to the first immigration laws that actually predate 1776, and I'm no history buff. I will go as far back as 1986, because that was a good year. It was also the year of the Immigration Reform and Control Act, the ICRA, Immigration Reform and Control Act. This was the year where businesses who hired people illegally in the country were fined or sanctioned. The bill also provided amnesty or cleared the record for anyone who was already in the United States. And this was 1986. The word amnesty's been popping up. I'm going to define it a little more clearly later. But it basically said, you know what, if you're here, It's not a crime. Figure it out. It was almost quadrupling of the amount of money we spent on border enforcement in 1986. It was a big increase in the amount of money that was available for what was then known as the INS, Immigration Nationalization Services and Border Patrol. Despite that, we jumped to the 1990s. I'm just going to give you big picture stuff. So we had that first big crackdown in '86. In the 90s, roughly 60 million immigrants were 6 million. If I said 60, I'm sorry. 6 million immigrants entered the United States without permission. And Mexico really jumped up. It was the first time there was a big spike in a Mexican population coming to the United States. But they weren't alone. The Philippines, Vietnam, the Dominican, and China were all statistically very close. I'll say that list again in case you're interested. Philippines, Vietnam, Dominican, and China. In the year 1990, Congress put in the Immigration Act. It did three really interesting things. First, it created ceilings on the total number of immigrants. A ceiling means, the highest number. And also, second, created a diversity admissions category that prioritized diversifying the country. So if you were applying from a country where there was a very low population in the United States, you were put at the top of the list. And then it tripled the number of visas. I'm going to define visas in the categories for people who are filling at-need jobs. So at-need jobs. The two big ones that were referenced here in the 90s were agricultural workers and medical professionals. There was a shortage that was recognized in both of those. And so Congress said, you know what? 3 times as many can come in to help fill those at-need jobs. So that was a really, that was not the more controversial bill. There were a couple of court cases that the Supreme Court ruled on in 1990. And there's a very famous quote from it that you see that calls, I'm going to try to quote it, you don't have to, but the Bill of Rights is a futile authority for the alien seeking admission for the first time to these shores. But while an alien lawfully enters and resides in this country, he becomes invested with the rights guaranteed by the Constitution. This, and it's been referenced a lot of times in something I'm going to talk about, was a Supreme Court ruling that said if you're in the country and you're not supposed to be here, the Constitution does not apply to you. Once you have permission to be in the country, the second you get permission, you're covered by everything. The whole Bill of Rights and Constitution. But up until then, you have no rights. Another quote from that is cases in which immigrants have been determined to enjoy rights establish only those rights once they have legally established connections. Everyone understand why that's important? This Supreme Court case said that while you can't be detained without permission, while you have certain rights to privacy, while you have First Amendment, Second Amendment, Fifth Amendment rights, do people who are visiting? Not if they're doing so without permission. Doesn't matter. Okay, we go all the way to 1996. The IRA. Worst acronym of all time. Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act of 1996. It did 4 things. 1, you had to verify anyone you hired was a U.S. citizen for the first time, and you had to do it via phone. You had to call into a system that was run by the federal government. 2nd, it made it very difficult for new citizens to access welfare. 3rd, it spent more money on border enforcement. You're like, oh, we need even more. And 4th, there's a law on the books that's never been enforced that says if you used to be a citizen and left, you can't legally come back. It's been referenced a lot with the Trump amendment, with the Trump administration. It's called the Reid Amendment. It's one of those things that it's on the books, but it was never enforced. It's like once you break up with me, you can't come back bills, what I like to read it as. It's like, oh, you choose to leave. You can't come back. This door is shut forever, ma'am. $1999, another Supreme Court case, Rodriguez v. U.S. Supreme Court said laws that discriminate against immigrants and their Fifth Amendment rights, due process, are fine. As long as there's a, quote, rational basis. This was in response to a couple of people who were upset about that 1996 law. Some immigrants said they were being unfairly treated. They weren't being protected. They were being singled out because they were immigrants. The Supreme Court said, you know what? You can do that as long as you can explain rationally why you are doing it. Um, 9/11 happened. 2001, there were a lot of laws that were passed that kind of impact immigration. Just sort of like 9/11 and shortly thereafter. Shortly after 9/11, between 2001 and 2005, the number of immigrants from across oceans went way down. The United States sort of cracked down on it, and so there's a bunch of stuff that says statistically the number of Mexicans and Canadians went way up. This is because there was a massive crackdown at airports, and people trying to come in, and then borders became much easier to cross. There was also, post 9/11, a bunch of sort of like enforced border stuff that happened. In 2002, they passed the Enhanced Border Security Entry Reform Act. It, once again, hired a bunch of new border agents and a bunch of new enforcement. was the first time that schools got on board in 2002. Federal government told schools to receive federal money, they had to report all foreign-born students to them. And it required all foreign nationals to carry IDs with them that were specially made. Basically your, I wasn't born here, but I live here, I promise, ID card. In 2005, they got around to defining those IDs. It was called the Real ID Act, R-E-A-L, all capital letters. It's an acronym for something, the Real ID Act. I think by 2000s, Congress had gotten a little bit better at the acronyms. They like naming things as opposed to the 90s when it was like the IIRA bill. It was like the Real ID bill. The Real ID bill made it where you have to have an ID to enter government buildings, board an airplane, open a bank account. It expanded the number of things you have to have a piece of identification to do.
And that was 2005.
2005. I don't think I had an ID with me the first time I opened up a bank account. Now if you open up a bank account, you got to bring an ID and proof that you were born here and a piece of your mom's hair and all sorts of stuff. It did some other stuff. It rolled back the number of people we allowed in who were seeking asylum. I'll define asylum a little more closely in a little bit. But asylum is people who were coming here because they were feared for their life or had political, cut that. It also increased more money and made it easier to do quick cases for immigrants. Expedited trials for immigrants. Basically, the whole bunch of border courts showed up is one of the things that this did. And the border court meant that if you were coming across and you were arrested, they used to be like, all right, well, you need a trial, and it's going to take us a few days to get you a trial and that sort of stuff. We're gonna now they're like, all right, we got a judge just sitting here waiting to hear. We can do it real quickly. And also, the Real ID Act is where states were required to meet a certain standard for their IDs. And it was the very first bill that made it illegal for states and others to build walls and border barriers along the foreign borders. They really, other than changing the numbers, there haven't been a ton of laws since then. There's an important one that we're going to talk about from 2012. It's called DACA, D-A-C-A, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals Act. June 15th, 2012, said that children who meet guidelines, you can defer action on what happens. And then you can renew it. Those to be eligible doesn't make it lawful. It just basically says, we're not going to do anything with your case. You continue to go to school. You continue to do the things you need to here in the United States. you're not committing any crimes, you're good people. It's just a list of a bunch of stuff. And that was a big change in 2012. While there's a whole bunch of talk about immigration, there have not been any immigration, as far as Congress is concerned, passed since 2012. So, that's the last 26 or so history of laws and where we are in terms of immigration. Do I have questions about those laws? Yes, ma'am.
In the 1990 Congress versus U.S.,
Yeah.
does this only apply to illegal immigrants or also legal?
In the 1990s?
The 1990 Rodriguez versus U.S.
Yeah.
laws that discriminate against immigrants' rights in the Fifth Amendment, does this only apply to like?
So that particular law was about people being harassed around the borders and being detained because they looked immigrant. And they said, looked immigrant. And this ruling was they can do that as long as they can rationally explain it. Yeah, it doesn't matter. So it was about discriminating against someone for belonging to a class of people. There's a bunch of stuff. Yes, sir.
Could you repeat the name of the Enhanced Entry Act after 9/11?
Yes. Enhanced Border Security and Visa Entry Reform Act. EBS VERA. Although I've never seen it written that way. Enhanced Border Security and Visa Entry Reform Act. I saw his first. Yes, sir.
Me?
Yeah.
Okay. So with the Real ID bill, you said that it's the first bill making it illegal to build walls on foreign barriers.
Yeah.
Has that been brought up at all with like what's been going on with Trump's wall? Like, is that being brought up, or are we?
Yeah. So they built barriers along certain places. Those exist, but it's not a comprehensive one. It's not just a total Great Wall of China style wall. There are just certain borders in certain areas. El Paso, my understanding, I've never been. I listened to a podcast. It's like the whole southern border is shared with Mexico. And so the city of El Paso, this made it possible for them. They just built a giant wall there.
So,
Trump is saying, hey, we got this wall. Let's just make the Mexicans pay for a whole wall just along the whole border. Done.
so it's just no one bringing up the fact that that's illegal, or?
It is legal. This made it legal.
Oh, it made it legal.
Legal to build. Did I say illegal?
Okay.
There you
That
go.
makes
This is
a
good
lot
time
more
to
sense.
questions. No, prior to that, it was illegal.
Okay. I thought you said illegal.
I may have. I apologize. It made it legal to build these
Okay,
barriers.
that makes a lot more sense.
Yes, ma'am.
So when they make the foreign students wear their IDs, isn't that signaling them out? Or
Yes.
singling them out to a mass population of people who didn't want them there, and potentially be ignorant of their duties?
Yes. That's there. Yes, sure. That's a normative question. I agree with you. Yes. The Supreme Court said that they're not wearing IDs around their necks or anything like that, or it's not a scarlet letter I or anything like that. It just means that you need to have your ID on you. And then they previously said they can just pull you over if you look like someone who has it. I'll take 3 more questions and moving on. I already heard from you. Yes, right here, Finn.
So the enhanced border security, the thing about the schools, was that under enhanced border security, or that was a separate thing, right?
About schools? No, that was part of the enhanced border security.
Okay.
So they started collecting data on students. And prior to that, schools had to educate anyone who showed up, but they didn't have to keep reports. Now they had to keep reports and turn it in. Yes, ma'am.
So in the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act,
Yes.
I know it gave amnesty for immigrants already in the United States, but what else did it do?
It started sanctioning on businesses. So if you could prove that a business hired someone who wasn't a U.S. citizen, they could be fined and sanctioned by the government. It also was the first bill that really was a massive, starting in '86. And what I was going to say about this, if you kind of step back and look at your notes, it's like they do something that's really strong against immigrants, and then they loosen a little bit, and then increase enforcement, and then loosen it, and it's kind of been a back and forth that is, but every time they increase border security. And a lot of these bills are both. So this bill, it made it illegal. Like if you hire someone who here's illegally, it blamed the businesses. It increased enforcement, but it said if you're already here illegally, we're not going to arrest you. You have amnesty. Yes?
So what was the document that said that if you used to be a citizen and you left, and then you can't come back to the United
Oh, that's one of my favorite little things. It's the Reed Amendment, R-E-E-D. It attempted to deny visas to former U.S. citizens, but it's never been enforced. Yeah.
Oh, and also, what does the I-I-R-I-R-I-R-A stand for?
Okay, little Eller, check my acronyms. I love it. Let me find it. So it's 1996. Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act of 1996. Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act of 1996. Yes, ma'am, with purple.
So you mentioned that there was a Supreme Court case that ruled that like if you're a foreign person and if you're like in the United States, that you're not entitled to like due process or like anything enumerated in the Bill of Rights. But does that mean like if you're a tourist and are arrested in the United States, that like you're not entitled for fair trial or like an attorney?
I don't know. They are not attempting to immigrate. They are here visiting. I know when I've traveled before, I've been told to be very careful because I don't have many rights when I'm foreign born and traveling in another country. But it's such a small statistic, I have no idea. It is referring to people who are attempting to live here but have not gone through the proper channels. And so it was the foundation of this Rodriguez decision that was just asked about there. It's like, isn't that discrimination? Yes, absolutely. And the Supreme Court said it's okay. Yeah.
And that one only applies to undocumented immigrants, not like legal immigrants?
Correct.
Okay.
And unless they already have started the process, and we'll talk about the process in a minute. Yes.
Were there repercussions for any immigrants who didn't wear the real ID?
So you can be detained. The cops can pull a person over and say, hey, we don't think you're American. If you have your ID and you show it to them, then you're fine. And then there's a this is interesting. If you can't prove that you are, then they can detain you. And so the big thing that's happening is people are saying, what's happening to people that these cops think look like they're not American, but they don't have to have an ID because they are citizens of the United States, and the cops harass them. And so there's a very interesting podcast about students who went to El Paso High School, which is right on the border, and the law doesn't tell them they have to carry ID, but the cops think that they should have to have an ID, but they don't have to have an ID, and it's messed up. Yeah.
And one more thing. Was it for the real ID? Was it just for students that they have to wear ID, or was it for like any immigrant?
Any immigrant. And if I use the word wear, I apologize. They just have to have it on them. Okay, let's talk a little bit more in depth about DACA, because that's the thing that you've probably heard the most about in the news. There's a big discussion with Congress and that sort of stuff. It is an American immigration policy that allows individuals who were in the United States as children, younger than 18, to not be deported, to not be arrested. And so that word is deferred action. And they could then become, if they came forward, they could become eligible for a work permit. They could be eligible to go to college in the United States. They could get permission to do all of these things. They just didn't, they couldn't have a criminal record, and they had to, continue to work and continue to do it. It was announced by Obama in 2012. The first DACA applicants were in August 15th of 2012, so almost 6 years old now. In 2014, Obama said he was going to expand it, wanted to cover more people, more groups. And this was the first sort of pushback. A bunch of states then sued the government to get it blocked. A bunch of states said, hey, you can't do that. And the court said, yes, he can. Yes, the government can. In June of 2017, the Department of Homeland Security, June of 2017, rescinded that expansion. Like, no expansion of DACA. We are rolling back what Obama tried to do in 2014 and announced, and we're just reviewing the whole thing. In September 5th of 2017, Trump said, you know what, we're getting rid of DACA. It expires in 6 months if Congress doesn't do anything about it. He asked for the DREAM Act. The DREAM Act, you'll also hear in this, it basically kind of goes on here. It says it was a make it where if you are in the DACA program for long enough, you can become a citizen. You can eventually, oh, now you're a citizen. Maybe, you know, how many years. There's a debate in Congress and stuff about how to actually write it. There's been a bunch of studies about DACA. If you're interested, I encourage you, honestly, to just like Google it, or the Wikipedia page links to a whole bunch of other studies that other people have done. There's a bunch of it that says that it was very popular, one, that a lot of people, a lot of immigrants came forward and said, hey, I would like to apply for it. That it increased the workforce. There was not an increase in unemployment. And it also has a criminal part in it. You hear that? It's just like, if you get arrested when you're DACA, you lose your DACA status. If you commit a crime, you lose your DACA status. You often hear, like, I don't know, Trump tweeted out, these are good kids, or whatever. I think that's what he means. Like, you don't do bad stuff. So DACA is still on the books. The DREAM Act is no longer being pushed. And on May 1st of this year, so a little over a month ago, 7 states, I know they're led by Texas, I'm afraid to Google who all the 7 states are, but I'll figure that out before the end, filed another lawsuit, very similar to the previous one, saying DACA is illegal and want to challenge the program. The Trump administration, via Jeff Sessions, has said, so unlike the last time when states sued, the Obama administration defended it in courts. Now, Jeff Sessions and the Trump administration have said, we will not defend it. And that's their new stance. So they are not going to, if the states bring suit, they're not going to defend it. Which means if it's going to be defended by lawyers and that sort of stuff, it's going to have to be by either other states or private individuals. And that's where we are with DACA. Yes, ma'am.
So is the DREAM Act no longer in place, or is it?
My understanding is the DREAM Act was always talked about but never passed. And the DREAM Act was a modification of DACA that said that DACA could lead to citizenship. That's no longer being considered. Yes?
So once a child that was enrolled in DACA turns 18,
Yeah.
does that do all special privileges end and they just become undocumented?
No.
Okay. And then, does the Bill of Rights, that applies to
Yes.
DACA?
DACA is one of many examples of being here with permission on a visa or anything else. Yes, ma'am.
For the states that sued for the 2014 expansion,
Yeah.
were they border states, or like what states were they that sued?
I have no idea.
Okay.
I bet we could figure it out and pick which states we think it was, but I don't have that list. Yes, sir. I mean, why would Trump want to blank is not one that I am clinically or professionally capable of answering. I have no idea. When he originally sent the tweets that he was going to do it, he said it's because he wanted Congress's opinion on it, and he didn't think it would happen. As an administration, they definitely ran on we need to be harder on immigration. I'm not sure. The statistics are somewhere between 70 and 80% of Americans think that DACA is a good program, that's doing a great thing. So honestly, I have no idea, no clue. Yes.
So for DACA, is it when it was put in place in 2012? Was it only for people who were like children or minors then, or if you were brought as a child but are like 30 something now, would that also be okay for you?
My understanding is if you were under the age of 18 in the United States, but didn't have a visa or a permit to be here, you could come forward and apply for DACA. Yes.
So if DACA were to like be canceled and those eight million people that came forward
Yeah.
to be processed and everything, with that information, do you think would it be used against them?
Do I think? Yes. That's most of the stuff you read, that it's cruel. That it was a bill that came, hey, you're here, it's no longer a crime, come forward and apply. And now all of these people's names are literally registered. And they came forward, they said, hey, we want permission. And if DACA goes away, all of a sudden there's a list of a bunch of people that a person who wanted to might deport them. That's the outcry. I mean, that's the source of why people are upset. It'd be like me saying, hey, some got stolen. If you come forward, I'm not going to be mad. We're just going to have a lesson. And the people who come forward, I'm like, okay, good. And then I kick you all out of camp. That to me, that's what it would be like. Okay, last one. Yes, sir.
How many people are covered by DACA?
Give me a second.
I think 80,000.
Yeah, around 80,000. It's not quite 100,000. Okay. Another thing that's been popping up in Google News that you've been hearing about, there was a CNN report on it in the airport yesterday where I was, is this thing that's happening with separating families. I wanted to kind of go over some of that statistics. You'll also hear you'll hear it in quotes. It was on the front of the USA Today. 1,500 lost children. Basically, Attorney General Jeff Sessions has said that they are going to have a zero tolerance policy for people trying to come into the country without permission. And so the new policy is to take the children away from their parents. It's happened to at least 1,500 where they will take, not yet, they will take the parents, they'll start with the detention, and then they're taking the children, and according to them, they're putting them into foster care or whatever. That was Chief of Staff John Kelly told NPR on Monday, quote, "Don't worry, the children will be taken care of. We'll put them into foster care or whatever." Jeff Sessions, when asked about it, said that, quote, "If you are smuggling a child, we will prosecute you, and the child will be separated from you as required by law." Their claim for doing this is that to create a deterrent or a disincentive to attempt to come into the United States. Someone might say, well, that's disgusting and gross and evil. And I believe Jeff Sessions' response might be, yes. This is causing a bit of an uproar. You see now how they do this. You can kind of circle back up if you want to that Rodriguez decision. They don't have any constitutional rights, so they can get away with it. I saw a hand pop up in the middle of this. Did I answer?
You answered it. What was the reasoning behind snatching children?
That's their argument.
Um,
Yes.
so I recently read a book on economics and incentives.
Good for you.
Wouldn't like trying to get their children into a better country like put more of an incentive onto trying to smuggle them across? So yes, they are separated and the parents have to stay in their country.
Yeah.
But getting the children over would be better for them.
There's a lot to break down in that sentence. Why parents make decisions, I'm not sure. I get sure. Also, no, never. You know, it's like I'm gonna go with absolutely not. But yes.
Are like the kids allowed to get leave the country once they're like 18?
No one knows. In response to the question, I read the direct quote. This was from 2 days ago. The children will be taken care of, put into foster care, or whatever. Next question. So that's what the White House Chief of Staff said. Yes.
So with the separating families, what happens if the child's like, if they're not really, well, like they're technically an adult, like they're 18 years old?
Yeah.
So do they?
Then that's not a child.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
What about like babies or like toddlers, newborns, still separated?
Yeah. According to in the picture, there were several children younger than 2 that were in the.
Like even if they're like still dependent on their mother.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
So what about if some immigrants are finding out they have their child on U.S. soil?
Yeah.
What will happen to those children?
So that's all of these immigration questions are tough because I have opinions, and my opinions are very strong and what would happen to those children. There are some people who say derogatory things about that. The statistics don't back up that is actually a thing that happens. Just sort of like the myth of the mom being like running into California to have a baby, and then the baby's an American, and like, yay, they have a birth certificate, and do whatever you want with me, just take care of my child. I find it to be fairly derogatory understanding of the way that it happens and stuff like that. But you have heard phrases from some anti-immigrant organizations that like anchor babies is the phrase that you can Google to read about that. There's some pretty good literature about that. I don't know. I'm not sure. I will say, as I try to move this on, is like I think that second category is very catchy and it's in the news and that sort of stuff. The debate topic and why we chose it is there was just a discussion. It's like, hey, let's talk about immigration, and I think it's obvious why it would be a debate topic. One, it's very timely with the Trump administration, et cetera. There's a whole lot of stuff going on with it in the news, so it's very there. Second, probably more than anything, is there's good arguments on both sides about this stuff, but you'll notice at the very beginning that the topic is about legal immigration and decreasing restrictions on legal immigration. So this policy of separating families is not a restriction on entering for legal immigrants. It's a restriction on people who are trying to enter the country not through the normal process of laws and that sort of stuff. So the debate topic is a little smaller. It's not just resolved, let's talk about immigration and all of its many facets. It's let's talk about the laws that were put in place to restrict a very small subset of legal immigration. And I'm about to give you the sort of like 5 or 6 ways that happens. Yes? And then
Are these laws just like the DACA and stuff? Is it just for like Hispanic immigrants or is it for like all?
All of them. To my knowledge, there's no like laws that are written that way, even if they are enforced that way. Yes? Yeah, you had your hand up for a
Okay,
while.
so, yeah, so on DACA and separating families, like for both those, you said that the definition of a child was like 18 years old.
Yeah.
But the INA defines it as 21 years old. So how did they
Okay,
make
there you
that,
go.
But how did they make that distinction? Because I know
They
for
rolled some
DACA
dice and were like, 21 sounds better than 18. I have no idea.
Okay.
They're like, they can't drink, that's a child. Who knows? They can vote, though, with no beer. You pick this president, but you can't take a shot afterwards. All right. So, there are 6 categories, then, of legal immigration. There's asylees. This is a person who enters the country, either port or border, and says they are unable, unwilling to return because they are being persecuted. They have a well-founded fear of persecution. Based on your race, your religion, your political opinions. While there is no limit on the number of people who can be granted asylum, the process of turning from an asylee to a permanent residence, only 10,000 people can do that a year. So, someone said Syria was really high up there. If you're from Syria, there's a war going on, you show up in the United States, you're like, I'm here, I want to claim asylum, I feel that I will be killed if I go home. Okay, start the hearing for asylum. Or, I'm in this racial group or this minority group. I have fear that I'm going to be persecuted and I can prove it. You can't, the government doesn't just say like, oh, you do? Oh, okay, come on in. They say, okay, why? And what's your proof? And why is it well-founded? And is it based on race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or social group in a country where that is happening? And by the way, from a country means which country you came from. So if you're in Syria and then you go to Germany and then you try to come to the United States and want asylum from Syria, what do they tell you on the border? On the border?
Go back to Germany.
Yeah, no, you're German for our intents and purposes. You are in a place where you had asylum, so you need to talk to the Germans about that. Category 2, employment-based. Employment in this includes workers, temporary workers, and investors admitted because of their particular skills. Makes me think of taking a set of skills. Or they are sponsored by an employer. So an employer wants to hire a person. Yes, ma'am.
What about outsourcing?
What about?
Like, what would that be considered legal immigration? Like,
No.
Okay.
That would be a company getting up and leaving.
Like,
Or hiring, opening up an office somewhere else.
well,
Outsourcing would pop up, and I can throw that onto my stuff at the very end. But it's an economic response to difficult immigration policies.
if a foreign company starts starts something in the United States,
Mm-hmm.
then would that be considered legal immigration from like some of its workers come here?
I mean, it's considered legal immigration if they go through the visa process and fill out the paperwork or get it sponsored, or there's an investor visa. So if someone says, I have $1 million, I would like to invest in the U.S. economy, there's a visa for that. There are categories, but I'm talking about the six types. Number 3, family-based. Family-based immigrants there are 3 categories. There's 1, the married or unmarried adult children of U.S. citizens. The adult children of U.S. citizens. 2, there's categories for spouses and children of legal immigrants. You can add the phrase unmarried in front of children there. If your children are married and you're an immigrant, they've lost it. Or 3, siblings of U.S. citizens. So, the first one, it's citizens, it's the married, unmarried, the children, people you're related to. There's the spouses and unmarried children of immigrants, and then there's the siblings of U.S. citizens, are some of the ways you can start and come to the United States. Category 4, immediate relatives. People who are part of the nuclear family of a U.S. citizen. This, by the way, is the unlimited category. Unlimited. Immediate relatives are described and defined as your, quote, nuclear family. Who do you think the government thinks is in your nuclear family?
Parents.
Hold on, wait. Yeah, I can't believe you all went to parents. Yes, parents of U.S. citizens.
Children, siblings.
You all aren't saying the most popular one. Your husband or wife, your spouse. That's the largest group here. Your spouse, that is the biggest group. Spouse, unmarried children under 21, your parents, that's it. Yes?
So if you were like our age and you were a legal citizen but your parents weren't, how would that work for immediate relatives?
You're a citizen as long as you're over 21. I don't know how it works for like a 15-year-old. That's an interesting question. Yes?
So is this like similar to chain migration?
Yes, that's a derogatory phrase for immigration that happens via chain. You'll see that it's like, they keep marrying someone back home and sneaking them in and that sort of stuff. But yeah, that's what that phrase is talking to. Or chain migration is just another way of saying that, like, you let someone in and they bring 5 people with them, and then they each bring 5 people with them, and yes.
What's the difference between a passport and a visa? Or are they the same thing?
They're not the same at all. A passport is just permission to travel. So if I go to any country, well, there's some exceptions there. If I visit another country, I need a passport. They check it at the airport. They say, Mr. Herndon, how long are you going to be here? Da, da, da. That's a passport. A visa is a credit card in your wallet, but it's also permission to reside. It usually has a time limit on it as well. Yes, ma'am.
So let's say that you are married, but you get divorced.
Ooh.
Would you still have the family based under you if you've been divorced, or would that immediately go away with the divorce?
I don't think it goes away.
Okay.
I believe that there is it's like an employment benefit. I think you have to stay married so long or whatever, and you agree like you're not going to get a divorce. It's like you can't like marry them and then the next day get a divorce. I'm fairly certain that you have to be married for a certain amount of time, but I do not know the answer to that. I can make some phone calls, or I bet your lab leader can. Yes, ma'am, and then you. Yeah.
So what if you have a visa being married to
Okay.
a spouse and you get a criminal record there, or you have a criminal record back where
Oh,
you're from?
I don't think that matters. I don't think that matters. I think family visas, unlimited. If I marry someone, I am a U.S. citizen. If I marry someone who is not, they can reside here, apply for citizenship as my spouse.
What if they get a criminal record?
I don't think that matters. I don't know how to say that in any other way. I'm fairly certain that under this category, that does not matter. I think some of the visas it does, but this one, no. Yes?
I just can't answer the question. I think it's like 2 years of being married to a U.S. citizen as an immigrant.
Okay.
And then divorce is don't matter.
Okay, boom, 2 years. I feel like there are movies that cover this all the time. You should find one. Yes?
This is going back to the Immigration Act. So like, was the Immigration Act the one that like it only allowed one Chinese immigrant into the United States per year? Was that because I remember somebody telling me that in social studies class, was there
I
ever?
think someone was messing with you.
No,
There
no,
are
the teacher
caps.
was saying it, but, like-
There are political caps that occur. So like no one from Cuba can come. We were sanctioning Cuba. That was the thing. There have been and then gone away country limits. I don't think it's ever been one. And there may have been. You're getting older than 1990. Now we're talking like U.S. history. You got to ask someone who actually knows something, not someone who just sounds like they know something. So, but your lab leader, you can ask. But I think that's some old history stuff. But we've been at war with countries, and we've said no one. We've cut off immigration, which I guess that makes sense. It's just like we're at war, so you can't send people over here right now. Okay, that was a bit of a throwback. Let me find out where I was. Oh, here. Lottery admissions. 55,000 each year. Let them in. You can apply. They pull a name out of a hat. They do still prioritize diversity. Allegedly. I don't know. That number changes each year. It's a visa. Come live in the United States and apply for citizenship. I think it's pretty simple. And number 6 is a refugee. Refugees are categories as opposed to an asylee, who is a person who just shows up. Refugees are categories that are set each year, or there's a ceiling set by the president. It's supposed to consult with Congress. They're eligible for lawful permanent resident status if they're here for a year and they're good. It's for any group or area where there is persecution or violence that is threatening their lives. So when you say Syrian refugees, that would be the administration saying, hey, 10,000 Syrians who would like to come visit the United States and get permanent residence, stay here, or there may be other groups. Changes regularly. So 1 and 6, do you appreciate the difference? Category and individual. There is a preference system. The preference system came from the Immigration Act of 1990 that I referenced. It's basically a way, they define sort of like the priorities within each of them. So like, for instance, it says that for your family and your employment-based visas, if we're asking how to extend it, it's 1, your children, 2, spouses, children, and your older children of people, then your married children, and then your brothers and sisters. And so basically, whenever they're going through it and there's a cap on something, They'll be like, category 1, we're going to let in as many spouses as we can. And those have to be filled up before we'll move on to number 2, which is your children. And on to number 3, which is, I'm sorry, children was 1, right? Children is 1, and then spouses. For employment, so if you're here for an employment-based, those are all capped every year. They'll have a hard number, like 60,000. And so the preference system might be country by country or employee or lottery. But they're capped at a hard 60,000 with the preference going. Need no break. Power through. Okay, I think I can knock this out in about 10, 15 minutes. We can be done. Or we can take a break and we can go through it slower. I say let's take a break, let me catch. We'll do like a 5-minute. People can get up, use the restroom, and that sort of stuff. And then we'll come back, okay? Start thinking about your questions going through your notes.